Hello there and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Casey and I'm the designer behind the indie sewing pattern company Pattern Scout. If you saw my last video where I shared the contents of my handmade wardrobe, you will know that I have hacked this pattern over and over and over again. I love it so much. I've made other outerwear projects with it. I've actually made a sweater with it. It's just a very simple, basic pattern that begs to be hacked. Whenever I'm designing a sewing pattern to sell, I really am always thinking of ways that this pattern can be hacked into new styles. So that is what I have done with today's project. I took the Cozi jacket and just did a few simple tweaks to the pattern to turn it into a long teddy coat. And it is super comfy, super cozy, and yeah, I can't wait to share it with you. So without further ado, let's get started. The fabric that I'll be using for this project is a faux Sherpa fleece that I picked up at Joann Fabrics. And I have used this fabric before for other projects, and it gets just a little bit more nubby of a texture with wear and washing, which I actually really like. I'll be cutting all of my pattern pieces on a single layer of fabric. This is just because this fabric is very bulky and I want to make sure that all of my pieces match up and are symmetrical. So I'm cutting the front bodice first, and I'm adding 13 inches to the bottom of the pattern to lengthen the jacket. I also want to make sure that I cut my notches at the arm, and I'm also cutting a notch at the bottom of the front bodice just to mark that location, and I'll match that up with the back bodice. To cut the other side of the front bodice, I'm just mirroring the piece that I just cut over on top of the fabric, and I'll use that as my pattern piece just to make sure that everything aligns well. And again, I'm making sure to cut my notches. For the back bodice, I'm using the front bodice as a guide for the side seam to make sure that I have those two side seams exactly the same length. And I'm also cutting notches at the bottom of the pattern piece and at the arm side and at the center back neck. And for the back bodice, since this is going to be cut on the fold, I'm cutting half of the bodice and cutting notches at the center back, at the bottom, and at the neckline. And then I'll just fold this over to cut the other side. And when I do this, I want to make sure that I get it lined up really nice and neat, and I'll also use my pattern piece to kind of make sure that it's still the same size and I'm not folding it over too far. And sometimes this fleece can be a little bit hard to get through with your rotary cutter, so I'm also going back and cutting with the scissors just to get all the little pieces that didn't get cut. So now I have the back bodice cut and the two front bodice pieces. To cut the sleeves, I'm doing the same thing, cutting on a single layer, cutting all of my notches. And when I cut the other sleeve, I want to make sure that I flip the pattern piece over so that the sleeve pieces are mirrored, because the sleeve is pretty close to symmetrical, but it is a little bit different on the front and the back of the sleeve for this pattern. The last piece that I'm going to cut right now is the collar. This is just a rectangular pattern piece, so instead of trying to cut this on the fold as indicated on the pattern, I'm just measuring how long and wide I need to make the collar and cutting it without the pattern piece. With my initial pattern pieces cut, I can start by sewing the shoulders of the front bodice to the back bodice, right sides together. And I'm using my serger for most of these steps, so I'm sewing this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and trimming off the excess with the serger. Once the shoulders are sewn together, I want to make sure that that seam is pressed toward the back bodice and I can attach the sleeve. So I'm just aligning the center notch of the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam, and then I'll align the back notch to the back bodice and the front notch to the front bodice, and then sew the sleeve to the arm side, right sides together. Again, I'm using my serger here to do this. Now that I have the sleeves attached, I can kind of try on the jacket and see where I want to put my pocket. I'm going to be adding an inseam pocket on both sides to this jacket, so I'm just placing my hands where I think a pocket needs to be and adding a pin there to mark that location for the top of the pocket. To make the pockets, I am using a scrap of nylon that I had in my stash, and I drafted a quick little pocket here. It's angling down, so it's basically just a U-shaped pocket that angles down and matches up with the side seam, and it's big enough for my hand plus about 2 inches all the way around. So I'll cut 4 pieces of this pocket out of my nylon fabric. Once I have my 4 pocket pieces cut out, I just want to add a facing to each of the pockets where they will be attached to the side seam. So I'm attaching the facing directly to the top of the pocket, just top stitching that in place. And I'll just trim the excess Sherpa fabric at the pocket edges. So now I have a nicely faced pocket. Next, I'll attach the pockets to the side seams of the bodice, and I'm putting the top of the pocket at that point where I marked on the side seam, and I will just sew this in place on my regular sewing machine using a 5/8 inch seam allowance and a straight stitch. Once I have that sewn down, I just want to flip the pocket to the exterior so that that seam is laying flat, and I want to top stitch that seam allowance down toward the pocket, so away from the bodice. Again, I'm just using my regular sewing machine and a straight stitch, and I'm going right along the edge of that seam. So you can see here how that looks on the front. You can barely see it. And then on the back, it's just kind of anchored that seam allowance down a little bit to help reduce the bulk. I'll repeat this step for both sides of the front bodice and both sides of the back bodice. Then I'll align the front bodice and the back bodice at the side seams and sew with a continuous stitch down the sleeve seam to the pocket, around the pocket, and then back down the side seam. And I'm showing here just going around that bottom corner where the side seam meets the pocket, and you'll do the same thing at the top of the pocket. But I'm going really slow and I'm trying to get that seam as straight as possible as I go under, so I have to kind of rotate this around under the needle. So once I have the side seam sewn, you can see I have a pocket now, and I really like the placement of the pocket. So the last thing that I want to do for these pockets is top stitch them to the front bodice, just so that they're not flapping around on the inside of the jacket. So right now I'm just pressing this down nice and flat, pinning it around the edge, and I will top stitch that in place on a regular sewing machine. I'm starting and stopping at the side seam. And I'm taking my time here to make sure that it's a nice and neat stitch, because this will be visible on the exterior of the jacket. I also want to just trim away some of this excess Sherpa that's kind of sticking out. So I'm just trimming away the extra fluff, basically. And you can see now how those pockets look. You have a little bit of a design detail there, and that's how the pocket looks at the side seam with the facings. And I really love how these turned out. Now it is time to add the collar. So I'm going to flip the jacket over so that the back is facing up, and I'm going to open up that neckline. So I've grabbed the rectangular piece for my collar, and I'm just marking the center on both sides of this rectangular piece on the long sides so that I can match it up with the center back bodice, right sides together. So I'll pin it there first, and then I'll just work my way around pinning at the center front, and then the other side of the center front, and filling in between with pins, and I'm going to sew that with a 5/8 inch seam allowance on the serger. So I've done that here, and you can see now that it's a much neater collar seam, and eventually this collar will be folded over. But first I want to install my zipper. So here I have a two-way separating zipper. So I want to take off one side of the zipper so that I just have this one side to work with. I've got the zipper pull all the way down at the bottom, and I've turned the zipper so that the zipper is right sides together with the front bodice. And I want to align the top of the zipper with the center of the collar where it's going to be folded. And then I'm just going to pin this in place down the length of the front bodice. And then I'll sew this in place along the entire length of the zipper. I'm using my zipper foot here, and I'm getting pretty close to the zipper teeth. I'm probably maybe an 1/8 inch or less away from the zipper teeth. When I get down to the bottom, I want to lift my presser foot with the needle still down and just move those zipper pulls out of the way so that I can continue all the way down to the end of the zipper. And I also want to be sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end of the zipper just to make sure that it's secure. Now that I have the zipper installed, I just want to conceal that zipper tape on the interior of the bodice. To do this, I have cut a strip of the nylon fabric, and I've cut it about 2 inches wide, and I'm going to start at the top. So I want to start where that neckline meets the collar, and I'm extending it about a 1/2 inch or so into the collar because it will eventually be concealed once we sew down the collar. And again, I'm just pinning this down the entire length of the front bodice. I'm even pinning it toward the bottom hem, even though the zipper doesn't go all the way down. And I'll sew that in place along that same seam where I attached the zipper, sandwiching that zipper between the bodice and the binding. Once I have that sewed down, I just want to flip that toward the interior of the bodice, and I will fold under that other edge to create a nice clean edge, and I'm gonna eventually just stitch along this entire thing. So I just need to pin this in place. And since this is nylon, it's harder to kind of iron this in place, so I'm just folding it and pinning it with several pins just to keep it in place. And I'm gonna stop right at the bottom of the zipper there. I'm not gonna go all the way down to the bottom. I'm gonna leave this loose down here at the bottom. And I'm sewing right along that edge so that it is a nice, neat stitch. And I'll double stitch at the top where it goes into the collar. And you can see here how that nicely conceals the zipper, and it's a nice little contrast on the interior of the jacket. I also want to make sure that my zipper can move up and down freely. So now that I've attached one side of the zipper, I need to do the other side. I'm going to zip the other side of the zipper back onto the one that I just installed, and I'll flip the jacket inside out and align that zipper with the other side of the front bodice. And I want to make sure that the collar seam matches up on either side of the zipper, so I'm first just aligning those two parts of the jacket on the front bodice and pinning that in place. Once I have that pinned, I can detach the zipper from the other side, and this is just going to make it easier for me to sew the other side of the zipper to the front bodice. And I'll take the same steps to attach the zipper just the way I did for the other side. So I'll sew the zipper on, and then I will do the binding to conceal the zipper on the interior of the jacket. So once I have both sides of the zipper installed, I can finish the collar. So first I want to flatten out the zipper at the front bodice. So I'm turning it out so that that zipper tape is exposed on the front exterior side, and I'm folding the collar down right sides together, and I'm just going to stitch here along the zipper to finish off the edge of that collar. And I've done that on both sides. Then I can flip the collar right side out on both sides to turn that raw edge of the collar toward the interior of the bodice. I've grabbed some contrast thread here, and I'm just going to use a needle and thread and hand sew the collar in place. And I'm only going to be basting it, so I'm going to do just a really loose basting stitch just to hold that bottom raw edge against the collar seam so that I can sew it in place later and it doesn't shift around on me, just because this fabric is so bulky. Normally I would pin baste this and just put pins in along here, but I think it's going to be easier for me in the long run if I just kind of baste this in place and get it nice and secure before I go under the sewing machine with it, since this is so bulky. And then I can pull out these basting stitches later after I sew the collar. And I've extended this just a little bit below the seam of the collar, so now I can take this over to my machine and I can stitch in the ditch to secure the collar from the exterior. Now that I've done that, I want to finish the bottom of the jacket. So I decided to do a longer jacket with just a 1-inch hem, and I'm folding this in the wrong direction, and I'm going to pin this in place. And similar to the way that I did the collar, I'm just going to stitch here right along the edge of where that binding is on the bodice. Now I'm just trimming the corners to reduce the bulk there. And the same way we did for the collar, we can now flip this right side out, and that starts to form our hem for the jacket. I also want to finish off this binding, so in the same way that I did before, I'm just going to fold under that edge, pin it in place, and stitch that down with top stitching, and then I can go in and stitch down the hem. And I'm not folding this under twice, I'm just folding it once. Again, because this fabric is so bulky, I only need to fold it once, and this fabric is not really going to fray, so that's not something that I really have to worry about with this project. I also want to hem the sleeves. So for this one, I decided to do a 3-inch cuff on the sleeve, so I just turned it under by 3 inches, and I will stitch this again on my sewing machine with a straight stitch to finish the sleeve hem. So this jacket is mostly complete, but I want to add a few details to kind of give it more of a jacket vibe and less of a like snuggie vibe, because right now it doesn't have a lot of shape. So I decided to add a patch pocket to the front, and here I'm just pinning kind of a mock-up pocket with a flap to see how I like that. And I actually decided that I didn't really love the flap, so I decided to go with just a single patch pocket on this right front bodice. I decided to do a pocket with a pointed bottom, and I also serged around all of the edges of this pocket because this nylon is prone to fraying. I set my iron to a nylon setting, and I'm just gonna press all of the edges of the pocket down toward the wrong side, but this fabric is the same on both sides, so it doesn't really matter. And I'll also press down about a 1/2 inch on the top side. So I'm just gonna top stitch along that top edge of the pocket to secure that, and then I'll pin the pocket to the jacket and top stitch all around the other sides and bottom. And so this step took a little bit of finagling because I had to really work to get all of this fabric underneath my sewing machine and make sure that I wasn't sewing down any other parts of the jacket. Next, I want to add a drawstring to this jacket. So I'm using my Choco liner to draw a line where I want the drawstring, and I kind of guesstimated that I wanted it about halfway between the side seam pocket and the bottom of the chest pocket. I also want the drawstring to end about 4 inches shy of the center front bodice. And then I'm just transferring that same line all the way around the entire bodice. I picked up these little grommets to make an opening for the drawstring, and I'm just cutting a really tiny hole in the fabric from the wrong side, and I will install these grommets per the package instructions. So this is a 3-piece grommet, and it has a little washer that goes in between the front and the back pieces. So I've put all of those on, and I have a little setting tool here, and I'll use my mallet to hammer this in place. I'll do the exact same thing for the other side of the front bodice. Now I just need to create a casing for my drawstring. So again, I've cut a 2-inch strip of that nylon fabric, and I folded the end and pinned that in place. And I'm aligning the bottom edge of that with the line that I drew with my Choco liner. And I'm just pinning that in place all along the bodice, making sure that I'm not stretching the nylon fabric or the bodice fabric so that it is nice and flat. When I get to the other side, I will trim with about a 1/2 inch overlap so that I can fold that under the same way I did for the other side and pin that in place. And I want those folded ends to just cover the grommets on both sides. And then I will just sew with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance along this entire bottom edge. And you can see where I've got that folded under there at the beginning. I did this for the beginning and the end of this casing just to finish that edge because I don't want that to be exposed and raw. And I'll sew along this entire bottom edge. When I get to the other side, I just want to go really slow and make sure that I maintain that fold in the very end of that casing. Next, I will fold down the top of the casing and then fold that over so that it covers the grommet and it also covers the raw edge of the seam that I just sewed. And I'm doing this similar to the way that I did the binding on the zipper. I'm just folding that edge under and pinning it periodically to keep it in place instead of ironing it. And I will continue doing this for the entire length of the casing and sew that down with a really narrow seam allowance. So I'm getting right along the edge of that casing. Once the casing is sewn down, I can insert a drawstring. So I wrapped a piece of tape around the end of my drawstring to keep it from fraying, and I pinned it with a safety pin. Then I'll use that safety pin to help me guide the drawstring through the casing. Also, for reference, I made my drawstring about twice the length of my waist circumference. And this took me a really long time, actually, so just be really patient with this step. I probably should have made my casing a little bit wider. Anyhow, I finally got it through, and I pulled it all the way through to the other side and pulled it through the grommet, removed my safety pin, and then trimmed off the end where I'd added the tape and tied a knot in my drawstring to complete the jacket.
If you enjoyed this video and you would like to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. It really helps out the channel a lot and it lets me know that I'm on the right track. And if there's anything in particular that you'd like to see me share here on the channel, be sure to leave me a comment below and let me know. I'm always checking the comments. I'm always open to suggestions. And yeah, I really enjoy trying new things, so definitely let me know what you'd like to see. Okay, I think that is all I have for you today. I will see you in the next video. Bye.